The battlefield was over. Rifles lay abandoned in mud, helmets scattered like discarded shells. Prisoners shuffled forward under watchful eyes, boots dragging, uniforms torn. For these men, capture meant more than chains, it meant silence. They believed they had vanished from the world the moment they raised their hands. To their families, they were already ghosts. The journey into captivity began with nothing but questions. Herded into trucks, they were stripped of weapons, searched, and marked with numbers. Faces were blank, voices hushed. Not one expected to speak to home again. In Germany, rumors had circulated that American captors locked men away forever, cutting them off until death. Silence was the punishment, silence the exile. Across the Atlantic, the voyage confirmed their fears. In the steel bellies of Liberty ships, they lay crammed in darkness, seasick and disoriented. Waves crashed against the hull like hammers, each swell a reminder that they were leaving everything they knew behind. Some whispered to each other in the dark, but even whispers carried despair. A man without a voice to his family was already buried. When the ships docked, the shock was not the guards or the fences, but the land itself. The America they saw from the docks was intact, untouched by bombs. Roads stretched clean and wide, houses stood painted and whole, and markets brimmed with produce. It was a vision alien to men whose families lived in ruins. Yet even this sight did not soften the certainty, they would never be heard from again. Inside the camps, order replaced chaos. Wooden barracks lined up like soldiers at attention, fences coiled with barbed wire, towers looming. The system was efficient, methodical, and suffocating. Each man was processed. History books often dwell on the battles, on the clash of tanks and the roar of artillery. But for these men, the true battlefield was emptiness, the fear that their names would fade from memory, their families left in ignorance. It is easy to speak of strategy and victory. It is harder to imagine the weight of silence pressing on men who had already lost everything. That silence was about to be broken. But before it was, they lived as shadows, suspended between life and death, between memory and forgetfulness. And here is where the story demands your attention. Most people remember the war for its firestorms and invasions, but they forget the quieter war, the fight against vanishing from history itself. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't scroll past. Subscribe, stay, and follow through this series, because what happened next shattered every belief these prisoners carried into captivity. The first glimpse of America came not through gunfire but through windows streaked with rain. The prisoners leaned against the sides of trucks, staring through narrow slits in the canvas. Outside rolled a world that looked untouched by war. Roads stretched wide and unbroken. Houses gleamed with fresh paint, porches lined with rocking chairs. Fields of corn swayed under the sun, their rows endless, precise. It was a vision almost unbearable for men whose families picked through rubble for food. The trucks rattled through towns where children paused their play to watch. Women carried baskets filled with fruit and bread. Men in work clothes walked calmly to factories. Not once did the prisoners see ruins, not once the jagged teeth of bombed walls. Every street, every storefront, seemed to whisper the same truth: America's war was fought oceans away. When the convoys turned into the camps, the shock deepened. Fences rose high, yes, and barbed wire glinted in the sun. Towers stood at each corner, rifles cradled in the hands of sentries. But inside the wire, order reigned. Wooden barracks stood neatly in rows. Gravel paths crunched underfoot. Latrines, water pumps, even mess halls had been built with the same precision as military drills. Processing began with practiced speed. Names recorded, numbers assigned, bunks allocated. The guards were brisk, efficient, but not cruel. Each step was conducted with the mechanical rhythm of bureaucracy. To men who expected beatings, the indifference felt unreal. Captivity was meant to strip them bare, to crush them. Instead, it was filed, stamped, and scheduled. It was during this routine that the announcement came. A man in uniform stepped into the barracks, flanked by an interpreter and a representative from the Red Cross. His words, translated into German, fell like stones in a silent room: "You will be permitted to write letters home." For a moment, no one reacted. The prisoners stared, waiting for the hidden threat, the cruel twist that would reveal itself. But the interpreter repeated it slowly, carefully, outlining the rules: 2 letters and 4 postcards each month. They must be written in German. They must be legible. They must avoid details of the war, or the censors would strike them out with thick black lines. But the letters would go, through Switzerland, through Sweden, across the seas, into Germany. The disbelief was so sharp it felt dangerous. Some muttered it was impossible. Others hissed that it was bait, a trap to lure them into false hope. One voice whispered that these camps had been built not for soldiers but for astronauts in the 1940s, and that everything they saw was staged theater. The mistake, absurd yet persistent, spread quickly through whispers, because the truth itself seemed too fragile to trust. But the officer and the Red Cross man remained calm, almost bored, as if this extraordinary promise was nothing more than procedure. And perhaps that was what unsettled the men most: mercy delivered without ceremony, as though it were ordinary. That night, the barracks hummed with unease. Some men sat rigid on their bunks, convinced the letters would never leave the wire. Others whispered of wives waiting in darkened apartments, of mothers who had not heard a word in months, of children who might not even know their fathers still lived. Hope and suspicion tangled together until sleep would not come. The war was not over for these men, but in that announcement a different kind of battle began. Between silence and speech. Between loyalty and longing. Between the propaganda they had been raised on and the possibility that the enemy might allow them to reach across an ocean. History often records wars in shells and steel, but in that moment the war inside the barracks shifted to paper and ink. The possibility of words became more powerful than the threat of weapons. And that was the beginning of the true shock, not that they had been captured, but that in America, they would be allowed to write. Morning came with the usual routine: roll call, boots crunching on gravel, numbers shouted and scribbled into ledgers. The prisoners stood stiffly, the air thick with resignation. Nothing about the day seemed unusual. And then the guards ordered them into the mess hall, where benches stretched in rows beneath a roof of wooden beams. At the front stood an officer, an interpreter, and a man wearing the unmistakable armband of the Red Cross. The room stilled. The prisoners waited for punishment, for labor orders, for some new restriction. What they heard instead was beyond imagining. The interpreter's words fell slowly, each one measured: "You will be allowed to write home." Gasps rippled across the hall, though quickly smothered. Faces remained blank, but eyes darted from man to man. Surely they had misheard. The officer continued, explaining the regulations. Each prisoner was permitted 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. All would be written on official forms supplied by the Red Cross. All would pass through censors. Any mention of troop movements, battles, or politics would be struck out in heavy ink. But the essentials, life, health, the simple message of survival, would be delivered. It sounded impossible. Some muttered that the Americans were lying, that the letters would never leave the fence. Others whispered it was worse, that the words would be rewritten by enemy censors, turned into propaganda before reaching their families. The hall buzzed with disbelief, tension rising like static in the air. The Red Cross representative held up one of the forms. Thin paper, carefully printed, with lines for name, address, message. He explained how the letters would travel, gathered into sacks, carried to neutral countries, passed through Switzerland or Sweden, then on to Germany. Weeks, perhaps months, would pass before replies came. But replies would come. That detail was the hardest to believe. Replies. The idea that words could travel both ways, that families might write back, seemed more fantasy than fact. Some prisoners clenched their fists, refusing to show hope. Others felt their throats tighten, memories of faces they had not seen in years breaking through the walls they had built around themselves. Whispers flew as soon as the meeting ended. A few insisted it was a trap, that anyone who wrote might be marked a traitor when the war ended. Others repeated wild rumors, that the letters would be flown across the ocean by secret American jet planes capable of crossing in a single day. The mistake spread quickly, half-believed, because no ordinary system could explain what they were hearing. Later, when the first sheets of stationery were distributed, silence returned. Men sat on their bunks, pencils trembling in their hands. For soldiers hardened by years of battle, the blank page was more terrifying than any battlefield. What words could bridge the chasm of captivity? How to explain defeat, humiliation, survival? Some stared for hours, unable to write a single word. Others scribbled mechanically, sticking to the safe formulas: I am alive. I am well. Do not worry. But beneath every careful line lay oceans of feeling unsaid. The weight of the page was unbearable. For the first time since capture, the prisoners were no longer shadows. They were fathers, sons, brothers again, men whose lives reached beyond the wire. That night, the barracks hummed with restless energy. Letters folded neatly were hidden under mattresses, held tight as though they might vanish. Men lay awake imagining the moment when wives or mothers would open them, when the news would ripple through homes that had long assumed the worst. It was a fragile hope, and many feared it would shatter. But fragile or not, it was hope. And in captivity, that was more dangerous, more precious, than any weapon. History often remembers the war in shells and fire. But inside those camps, the real battle was fought with pencils on thin paper. That was the battlefield where survival meant more than life, it meant being remembered. The forms came in stacks, thin sheets stamped with the Red Cross emblem. Guards and clerks walked between bunks, handing them out with the same indifference as they might distribute tools or rations. But in the hands of the prisoners, the paper felt heavier than steel. For days, they had argued about whether the promise was real. Now the proof lay before them: space for a name, an address, and lines where words could cross oceans. The silence in the barracks was so thick that even the scratching of a pencil seemed dangerous. Men sat with pencils poised but unmoving. Some stared at the page for hours, unable to summon words. Others began and stopped, erasing carefully, rewriting, erasing again. The pressure was unbearable. This was not a battlefield where bravery could be measured in action. This was a battlefield of restraint, where one misplaced word might be blacked out by censors, or worse, prevent the letter from leaving the camp at all. Most stuck to the safest of formulas: I am alive. I am well. Do not worry. It was all they could manage, all they dared. Anything more felt risky. They longed to say everything, to describe capture, to speak of shame, to ask desperately about family, but the fear of black ink striking their words kept them silent on the page. Yet even those few words carried immense weight. To write a name, to put ink to paper, was to declare, I still exist. For men who had believed themselves vanished, it was resurrection. Around them, small acts of emotion broke through. One man pressed the pencil so hard that the tip snapped, carving the page instead of writing it. Another folded his sheet 3 times before finishing a single line, as if each fold might shield it from being taken away. Some clutched the stationery against their chests, whispering names they had not dared to speak aloud in months. Arguments flared again in whispers. Was it honorable to write, or did it make them pawns in an American game? Could a letter truly cross an ocean in wartime? Some scoffed, repeating a rumor that the Red Cross symbol was not international at all, but the logo of an American company that owned the camps. The mistake gained traction, because it fit the suspicion that nothing could be as simple as it seemed. But suspicion did not stop the pencils. Line by line, the silence of captivity cracked. Prisoners who had gone months without speaking of their families now wrote names on paper, names that trembled in their hands. Wives, mothers, children, lives beyond the fence made real again through ink. The atmosphere in the barracks shifted. Instead of despair, there was tension, an electric current born not of fear but of fragile hope. Men lay awake that night, letters folded under mattresses, waiting for the moment the sacks would be carried away. It was not freedom, but it was proof they still had ties to the world outside. No bullet, no battle, no act of defiance had given them as much power as those letters. And yet the power was uncertain, balanced on the faith that the enemy would keep its word. History often remembers war in weapons and walls, but here, history was written in graphite and trembling hands. For those prisoners, survival was no longer only measured by breath, it was measured by words. The day came when the letters were gathered. Guards moved through the barracks with canvas sacks, their mouths yawning open like silent traps. One by one, the prisoners dropped in folded sheets, some quickly, some with hesitation, some clutching the paper until the very last second. The sound of paper sliding against paper echoed louder than rifles ever had. Once collected, the sacks were sealed with heavy twine. Prisoners watched as stamps were pressed onto the knots, as if binding their words with official weight. The bags were carried to trucks, tossed in with the same casualness as crates of supplies. To the prisoners, it felt like watching pieces of themselves being taken away. Rumors spread before the dust of the departing trucks had settled. Some insisted the letters would never leave the wire, that they would be burned in secret furnaces. Others claimed the words would be altered by American censors, turned into propaganda to mock them back home. A few believed something even stranger, that the letters were not carried across the ocean at all but flown first to London, then to Hollywood, where they would be rewritten into films. The mistake sounded absurd, yet it clung to whispers, because captivity twisted even the impossible into something believable. The truth was far more ordinary, though no less incredible. The letters were routed through the Red Cross, sorted in warehouses, carried across neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden, then placed onto ships bound for Europe. It was a slow, winding journey, measured not in days but in months. Inside the camps, the waiting became its own torment. Men counted weeks, then added more, struggling to imagine whether their words had crossed the Atlantic. Each night they replayed the lines they had written, fearing they had said too much or too little. Some cursed themselves for restraint, others for daring to say too much. The censor's black ink was another ghost in their thoughts. They pictured their words being struck out, entire sentences vanishing before their families could see them. Would a letter that read only, "I am alive," still bring comfort, or would it deepen the pain of silence? The questions circled endlessly in the barracks, feeding anxiety as steadily as the rations fed their bodies. Weeks stretched. The sacks left regularly, but replies did not come. Some men grew convinced that the Americans had lied, that the entire system was an elaborate deception. Others clung desperately to belief, whispering that their mothers or wives were even now clutching the envelopes, tears falling onto paper carried across oceans. At roll call, eyes turned toward the gates whenever a delivery truck appeared. When nothing came, faces fell, hope sagging like cloth in the rain. The uncertainty was a battle of its own, a war fought not with weapons, but with waiting. The journey of those letters was invisible, but it consumed the prisoners more than the fences or the guards. For months, they had lived nameless, cut off. Now their very identities were tied to envelopes sealed and carried beyond their sight. To doubt the journey was to doubt themselves. History rarely tells of these letters, of the sacks carried out under the eyes of men who held their breath as though life itself were tied up inside. Yet for those prisoners, the journey of paper across the world was as decisive as any battle. And perhaps that is the part of war we most forget. Victory is measured in armies and maps, but for these men, it was measured in whether ink on paper could find its way home. The day the first replies arrived, the camp shifted. It began quietly, trucks rumbling through the gates, guards unloading sacks that looked no different from grain or coal. But when the Red Cross clerks appeared, carrying bundles bound in string, the prisoners felt the air tighten. The long silence that had haunted them was about to break. Names were called one by one. Each syllable echoed like thunder. Men stepped forward stiffly, hands trembling as folded envelopes were pressed into them. Some clutched the paper to their chests before daring to open it, others tore at the seal immediately, eyes devouring every line. The reactions were as varied as the letters themselves. Some men collapsed onto benches in relief, tears carving lines down faces hardened by war. Wives had written of survival, of children waiting, of homes still standing despite the bombs. Others broke down in grief as they read words of loss, fathers gone, villages destroyed, families scattered. For them, the letters were both blessing and torment, proof of life and proof of devastation all at once. Not every man received mail. For some, their names were never called. They stood in silence, watching others read, their hands empty. Hope soured into dread. Did their families live? Had the letters failed to reach them? The uncertainty was worse than hunger, a silence even sharper than before. The letters themselves carried the marks of censorship. Thick black lines crossed out entire sentences. Words vanished under ink, leaving gaps like wounds across the page. Men traced the strokes with their fingers, desperate to guess what had been erased. A sentence that began with, "We are safe," ended abruptly, the rest lost forever. Yet even the censored fragments meant everything. To see a familiar handwriting, to recognize a signature, to hold paper touched by a loved one, these small things broke through the wire. For the first time, the prisoners were not only numbers. They were remembered. Rumors immediately filled the gaps. Some claimed that the fastest replies had come through a secret tunnel under the Atlantic, an impossible shortcut built by the Allies. Others swore that letters marked with heavy black censorship were proof that their families were under surveillance, that the Gestapo was intercepting every word. The mistake about a tunnel spread quickly, whispered in barracks, a desperate attempt to explain what felt like a miracle. The days that followed were restless. Men reread their letters until the paper softened, words nearly rubbed away by their fingers. Some folded the sheets into tiny squares, hiding them in boots or under mattresses, as though afraid they would be stolen. Others recited entire passages aloud, sharing fragments of survival with bunkmates who had received nothing. Jealousy and bitterness grew alongside relief. Those without letters eyed those who read in silence, resentment flickering in their faces. The division was sharp, but even resentment proved something vital. The letters were real. The silence had been broken. The camp itself felt different. For months, the barbed wire had stood as the only boundary. Now, ink and paper crossed it. The guards, towers, and fences were still there, but the letters pierced them in a way bullets never could. History often writes of battles as decisive moments. Yet for these men, a thin envelope carried more force than artillery. The replies changed everything. They reminded the prisoners that they still belonged somewhere, to someone, even across an ocean at war. And that is why these letters mattered. They proved that captivity was not the end of a man's voice. They carried the weight of survival, of grief, of memory. And long after the fences rusted away, it was those words, not rifles, that would remain. When the war ended, the gates opened at last. Prisoners were marched out not as enemies but as men marked for repatriation. Ships waited to carry them back across the Atlantic, back to a Germany they no longer recognized. In their hands, many carried letters. Some were folded until the creases split, others smudged by tears or sweat. A few men hid them inside uniforms, unwilling to let them go even for the voyage home. Those envelopes were more than paper. They were proof of survival, of connection, of being remembered through years of silence. Returning home brought another kind of shock. Cities lay in ruins, entire neighborhoods flattened by bombing. Families clutched the surviving letters like lifelines. Mothers told how a single postcard had kept them believing their sons were alive. Wives spoke of holding envelopes at night, tracing signatures by candlelight as bombs fell outside. For children who had grown up without fathers, the letters were their only memory, words in place of a face. For the former prisoners, the memories never faded. They spoke often of battles, of voyages, of captivity. But above all, they remembered the letters. More than fences, more than guards, more than towers, it was the act of writing freely that reshaped their idea of captivity. They had been enemies, yet allowed to speak across an ocean. That contradiction haunted them long after the war. The impact reached further than personal memory. Historians later noted that many ex-POWs defended the letter-writing policy as one of the most extraordinary examples of mercy in wartime. It had not erased hardship, but it had preserved humanity. In debates and interviews, they described it not as propaganda but as something real, something that changed the very texture of captivity. Still, myths lingered. Some men swore until their dying days that the war had not officially ended until 1949, when the last letters were finally delivered. The mistake clung to their stories, proof of how deeply those envelopes were tied to their memory of the war. Decades later, when survivors spoke to students or recorded testimonies, they often ended with the same reflection: the battles would be forgotten, but the letters would not. They were evidence that even in war, mercy had crossed borders where weapons could not. That is the true legacy of those words. They were not weapons, not treaties, not victories marked on maps. They were survival pressed into paper, fragile enough to tear, strong enough to outlast the barbed wire. History measures wars in terms of who won and who lost. But for these men, the war was measured in envelopes carried across oceans, in handwriting that proved they had not been erased. It was measured in words that reminded them, and the families waiting in ruins, that even in the darkest captivity, they were still alive. And that is why this story matters. Because wars are not only fought with guns. They are fought with silence, and sometimes broken by words. If you want stories like this to keep breathing, stories most history books never tell, then stay with us. Subscribe, and you'll see how the forgotten details of war still shape the way we remember it today.